The trail wound through the dense Appalachian forest, the kind of place where sunlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving the ground in a perpetual, restless twilight. Fallen logs littered the path, slick with moss and damp from days of rain, and the creek that ran alongside it whispered like an old, knowing presence. He paused to adjust his pack, the familiar weight of his camera against his chest, offering some small comfort, and listened. The forest seemed ordinary, so ordinary, in fact, that he almost let his guard down. By mid-afternoon, he came across the cabin. Small, abandoned, and constructed from weathered pine, it leaned slightly as though it had been slowly sinking into the earth for decades. The windows were opaque with dust, the door hanging crooked on its hinges, but it had walls and a roof, and that was all he needed. He set his pack down and began preparing the interior, arranging his camera gear, checking the lenses, and making a small fire in the cold stone hearth. Outside, the creek babbled lazily, birds called somewhere far above, and for a moment the world felt like it always had, untouched, natural, calm. But as dusk approached, a subtle shift came over the forest. The breeze stilled, and the soft sounds of wildlife seemed to fade. A distant bird call echoed out of rhythm, like a note struck in the wrong key. The creek's murmuring took on an odd, uneven pattern, almost deliberate. And then there was the rustle, a low, deliberate scraping from the underbrush just beyond the firelight. He froze. His heartbeat quickened, not with panic but with a sharp, instinctive awareness. Whatever had moved had not been the wind. He stepped closer to the cabin's door, listening. The rustle stopped, leaving only the muted, hollow sounds of the creek and the forest settling into twilight. For a moment, he convinced himself it was nothing. An animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But as he turned to hang his jacket, the sense of being observed prickled at the edges of his skin. The shadows beyond the firelight seemed heavier, more deliberate. Shapes brushed at the edges of perception, vanishing when looked at directly. The first night fell slowly, like the lowering of a curtain he had not expected. He lay on the small cot inside the cabin, camera beside him, firelight flickering across the walls. Every crack in the cabin floor, every sway of a tree in the dark, made him flinch. The creek sang its endless song, and somewhere in the distance the forest breathed, a slow, patient rhythm, waiting for him to notice. The rustle had not returned, but the feeling lingered, crawling across his skin, curling in the pit of his stomach. Something was there, beyond the light, something unseen, and Hollow Creek, for all its quiet, seemed to be holding its breath. Night had arrived with a heavy, almost liquid stillness. The forest, which had seemed so alive during the day, now pressed in around the cabin, silent and vast. Branches swayed slightly in a breeze he couldn't feel, snapping sharply in the distance like brittle bones breaking. Every sound was magnified in the dark. The creek murmuring against mossy stones, the rustle of dead leaves skittering across the forest floor. But beneath it all, there was something else. A subtle, persistent undertone that made him pause mid-step, as if the shadows themselves were moving just out of sight. He pulled his camera from its bag, reviewing the images from earlier in the day. At first, the photographs had seemed ordinary. Mist curling above the creek, sun slanting through the pines, moss glistening on fallen logs. But as he scrolled through the previews, he noticed shapes, dark, crouching figures lingering near the edges of the frame, fleeting and blurred, as if they had been there only when the shutter clicked. Each image seemed to show them closer, watching from a distance he had not realized existed. His pulse quickened, and he felt the first twinge of that deep, instinctual unease that gnawed at the edges of rational thought. He stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and moved along the perimeter of the cabin. The beam traced the familiar outlines of trees and the creek's gentle bend, but the shadows between the trunks seemed thicker here, deeper, almost tangible. There were sounds, soft, deliberate clicks and scrapes that didn't belong to any animal he could name. At one point, a small branch snapped behind him, and he whirled around, heart hammering, only to find empty darkness. The stillness returned immediately, but the pressure of it lingered, pressing down on his shoulders, making the forest feel impossibly large and suffocating. Everywhere he looked, the shapes seemed to cling to the edges of perception. They didn't move like humans or deer, but like distorted echoes of both, bending around the trees, avoiding direct sight. He noticed a pattern forming. The shadows never stayed in one place. Whenever he looked at a patch of darkness, it would dissolve, only to reappear behind him, at the corner of his eye, or in the frame of his camera. He tried shaking it off, reasoning it was exhaustion or imagination, but instinct whispered that the forest was playing a subtle, predatory game. Back inside the cabin, he set the camera on the small table near the hearth, reviewing images once more. Each shot seemed to distort slightly when viewed on the screen, shadows stretching and twisting in ways that were impossible under normal light. Something was moving, just beyond what he could see. He began noticing a rhythm in the darkness outside, a sway, a pause, a repetition that felt deliberate, almost patient. It was as though whatever lurked beyond the walls was aware of him, testing him, circling, waiting. He sat on the cot, listening. The forest seemed to breathe in time with him, heavy and slow. Branches scraped against each other with an unnatural insistence, and a low, almost imperceptible whisper threaded through the night air. He strained to catch words but found only disjointed sounds, like the wind forming syllables it shouldn't know. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the cabin's small walls felt simultaneously protective and imprisoning. He realized the shadows between the trees were not just empty spaces. They were alive with something intelligent, something patient. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt unmoored in the deep silence. Each glance toward the window revealed nothing, yet a prickle at the back of his neck reminded him that the shapes were always there, always waiting. And in that waiting, he understood the first real truth of Hollow Creek. The forest was watching, and it did not intend to remain hidden forever. The night deepened, and with it, a cold settled into the cabin. The warmth from the small hearth barely reached the corners, leaving the edges of the room shadowed and uncertain. He had taken to checking his cameras constantly, each screen flickering with images that made him flinch. Dark forms crouched near the trees, shapes that twisted unnaturally, almost human, almost not. Outside, the forest seemed impossibly still, the usual symphony of nocturnal insects and distant birds replaced by a silence that pressed against his eardrums. Then came the howl. It began low, deep, resonating through the hollow in a way that made the floorboards vibrate beneath his bare feet. It was guttural, raw, inhuman, but with a timbre that felt almost intelligent, as though it knew exactly where he was standing. The sound circled the cabin, echoing off unseen trees, approaching and retreating, never settling. His pulse raced, yet he could not tear his gaze from the window. Another howl, sharper this time, sliced through the night air, reverberating in his chest. He realized the sound wasn't coming from a single point. It was surrounding him, coming from every shadow, every hollowed space in the forest. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, the beam trembling in his hands. The night was black, absolute, yet he could see movement, subtle shifts in the darkness just beyond the reach of the light. His eyes caught fleeting silhouettes, crouching, waiting, almost too still to believe real. They moved with a strange fluidity, bending at unnatural angles, disappearing when looked at directly, only to reappear at the edge of the clearing. His camera, still in his backpack, seemed suddenly alive with urgency. He retrieved it, snapping shots into the dark, hoping to document, to understand, to prove it wasn't his imagination. The images confirmed the impossibility. Figures lurked among the trees, their limbs long and jagged, faces obscured but eerily human, crouched low, watching. When he lowered the camera, the air itself seemed to tighten, like a predator inhaling before a strike. Footsteps sounded on the perimeter, heavy and uneven, circling the cabin. They didn't approach in a straight line. They shifted unpredictably, sometimes stopping, sometimes dragging over the leaf-strewn ground, always present, always unseen. He ran his hands over the cabin walls, each creak and groan magnified in the oppressive silence, and felt them, whatever they were, pressing against the threshold of perception. Back inside, he set the camera on the table, reviewing the images again. One frame made him freeze. A dark figure crouched impossibly close, its limbs pressed against the cabin's wall, eyes invisible, yet somehow observing him through the lens. He blinked, and the figure was gone, but the unease remained, crawling up his spine, settling behind his eyes. Objects shifted in the cabin. The small cot creaked, the firelight danced strangely against the walls, and his backpack, the one he had left untouched, was moved a few inches. He could not remember moving it. The rustle of leaves outside became indistinguishable from scraping claws against wood. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet he felt trapped, a moth caught in the dim light of a dying flame. Hours passed in tense stasis. Each howl returned in cycles, echoing from every direction, punctuated by the subtle, deliberate sounds of something moving just beyond the cabin walls. He counted them, tried to measure their rhythm, but the forest refused consistency. By the time the first hints of pre-dawn crept into the treetops, he understood that the hollow was no longer simply a place. It was an entity, aware, patient, circling, waiting. The first direct confrontation had begun, though he could not yet name its form, and in that awareness he realized he was no longer alone. The shadows between the trees had become hunters. Morning arrived quietly, but the forest no longer felt benign. The sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, pale light glinting off dew-laden leaves. He stretched, exhausted from a night of restless listening, and forced himself toward the cabin door. That's when he noticed them, deep, jagged claw marks gouged into the wood, fresh, raw, and deliberate, running from the bottom hinge to the doorframe, as if something had been testing the barrier for hours. A shiver ran down his spine. The marks were too precise, too purposeful to be random. He crouched, examining faint footprints in the soft dirt surrounding the cabin. They were misshapen, elongated, and impossible to identify, neither entirely human nor wholly animal. Each print looped back, leading nowhere, disappearing into the undergrowth. The realization pressed against him like a physical weight. Whatever prowled these woods was aware of him, tracing his presence with careful intent. He moved around the cabin, searching for more evidence. Small disturbances appeared everywhere. The fire pit had shifted, the stones rearranged, his pack had tilted slightly overnight. Objects that had seemed settled the day before now bore subtle imprints, as though brushed by unseen hands. Each minute detail amplified his unease. The forest outside, normally comforting in its rhythms, now felt alive in a way that suggested conscious observation. Leaves whispered even in still air, Shadows stretched unnaturally, and every branch seemed positioned to watch or impede him. By afternoon, he tried to record the anomalies with his camera. Close-ups of the claw marks and footprints revealed textures too grotesque to classify. Flesh-like scratches gouged into the timber, soil disturbed as if by weight far exceeding his own. He reviewed the photos repeatedly, but each glance returned the same impossible impression: presence, intent, intelligence. It wasn't merely survival that had left these marks. It was an awareness, a deliberate challenge. As evening approached, the sun's retreat turned the hollow into a shadowed maze. The forest seemed to pulse in time with his heart, expanding and contracting, closing in. The hollow sound of the creek now carried the faint undertone of movement, footsteps brushing leaves just beyond the line of vision. Each time he stepped outside, the wind shifted, carrying whispers of something unseen, something circling, always returning, waiting. He noticed that every night the scratches grew longer, the prints more numerous, as if the forest itself conspired to mark his presence. When he attempted to rest on the cot, the sound of the floorboards creaking unnerved him. He counted, paused, and listened. Long, deliberate knocks echoed from the door, then silence. The claw marks seemed to gleam faintly in the firelight, more menacing than when first discovered, as though the wood had absorbed the entity's energy overnight. Outside, branches scraped against the cabin walls at intervals too precise to be wind. Every shadow cast by the flickering fire became suspect, some twisting impossibly before his eyes. By the time darkness fully enveloped the hollow, the scratches and signs of intrusion had multiplied. He felt the presence watching from every angle, each sound magnified, each shadow pregnant with anticipation. The hollow creek, once a simple companion, now became a sinister accompaniment, its murmurs echoing against the walls with the cadence of something alive. The forest was no longer just a setting. It had become an active participant, a predator in patience, testing the boundaries of the cabin and of him. Sleep proved impossible. Every nerve and muscle remained taut, listening for the next scrape, the next claw, the next impossible sign that whatever was out there had circled closer. And he knew, with a certainty that pressed like stone in his chest, that the hollow was far from done. The third night settled over Hollow Creek like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The wind had died entirely, leaving the forest unnervingly still. Even the creek's babble seemed muted, as though the water itself feared drawing attention. He had been pacing inside the cabin for hours, camera in hand, flashlight ready. Each creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension pressing against him from every corner. The claw marks from the previous day seemed to shimmer in the dim firelight, the scratches taking on a life of their own, like warning sigils etched by unseen hands. Then he saw them. Glowing eyes, bright and unblinking, pressed against the cabin's windows. 2, 4, maybe more. He could not count in the dark, but they were everywhere, watching. The shapes behind them were indistinct, twisted in ways his mind refused to fully register. They did not blink, did not shift in the way animals or humans might. They simply stared, patient and deliberate, their gaze probing the cabin's walls, measuring him, studying him. Heart hammering, he lifted the camera, hoping to capture them, to prove their existence, to anchor his own fraying sanity. The flash illuminated the forms for a heartbeat. Limbs bent impossibly, crouched or coiled in the shadows, faces stretched and distorted beyond recognition, yet almost human enough to make his stomach twist. He blinked, and the figures were gone. Only the empty forest remained, or so it seemed. Every attempt to move toward the windows was met with the same impossibility. When he shifted his flashlight beam, shadows danced just beyond its reach, slipping out of frame, always lingering at the edges of perception. Branches scraped the cabin walls with impossible timing, dragging slowly and deliberately as though tracing his movements. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing in, carrying a faint metallic tang that burned the back of his throat. His skin crawled as he realized that whatever was outside was not merely observing, it was waiting, testing the boundaries, circling him with patience born of centuries of practice. He tried to retreat, but the forest seemed to have condensed around the cabin. Every door and window led only to more shadowed trees, more impossible space. He felt the walls closing in, the timber groaning under some invisible weight. His camera flashed again, capturing images that made him recoil. Figures pressed impossibly close, limbs splayed against the glass, their eyes bright orbs of intent. One image, when enlarged on the screen, seemed to show movement inside the cabin itself. A distortion in the corner of the room, though no one had entered. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, marked only by the rhythm of the howls and the unblinking gaze outside. Every sound, every flicker of shadow, became a signal of their presence. The glow of the eyes remained constant in his memory, and with each passing hour, he felt the forest shrinking, the hollow compressing the space around him, funneling him into awareness of something ancient and patient. Sleep was impossible. Any momentary closing of his eyes brought flashes of glowing orbs, shapes pressing into the corners of his vision, and the unmistakable sense of something waiting just beyond reach. He could hear breathing, or imagined it, following the contours of the cabin walls. Every nerve screamed to flee, but the forest, the hollow, the eyes, they all refused it. Escape was a promise that did not exist here. By the time the moon passed overhead, casting its silvery light through the pines, he understood that the howls were no longer random. They were calls, tests, assessments of his endurance and fear. The eyes, bright and unwavering, were the first real confrontation with whatever had claimed the hollow, and he knew, with a certainty that froze him more than the chill in the air, that the forest itself had begun to close around him, leaving no path to safety, only the endless, patient gaze of the unseen. Panic began to take root. He had tried to leave Hollow Creek at first light, following the faint trail he had used to enter the forest, hoping distance and daylight might offer clarity. But as he moved, the path dissolved before his eyes. Familiar markers, bent trees, mossy stones, a particular bend in the creek, had vanished, replaced by unbroken pines and shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The forest had shifted. He stopped and turned in every direction, only to find the same cabin looming behind him, its windows dark and unyielding, as though the hollow had swallowed all routes of escape. He moved faster, urgency driving him, feet sinking into damp earth, branches clawing at his jacket, but the forest ignored his presence and refused guidance. Every turn he took led him back to the cabin, as though the landscape itself had become a loop, an impossible maze designed to disorient and trap him. The creek, once a comforting murmur, now sounded like water running in reverse, an inverted echo that twisted his sense of direction. Even the sun's movement seemed wrong, the light slanting from angles that made the familiar terrain feel alien and threatening. Each step forward brought new disquiet. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching into the path ahead like tendrils, then recoiling when he approached. Branches snapped behind him, but when he glanced back, there was nothing but the rigid, unyielding forest. His camera, once a tool for observation, now seemed like a warning device, capturing only hints of figures lurking just beyond the lens's reach. Shapes crouched among the trees, shifting in ways impossible for flesh and bone, their presence deliberate and measured. Desperation built into a cold, gnawing fear. He realized the hollow was not merely a location, it was sentient, aware of his attempts to escape. Every instinct screamed that he was being guided, herded even, by forces that did not belong to the ordinary world. The trail he had relied on, the map of memory etched in his mind, was meaningless here. He called out once, twice, into the empty forest, but no reply came, only the rustling of branches, and then a silence so absolute it pressed against his eardrums. He tried to mark his path, leaving scratches on trees and stacking small stones along the ground. Hours later, each marker was gone, as if the forest had erased every trace of his passage. Even the faint footprints he left behind disappeared into the damp earth, obliterated by some unseen force. The hollow had become a trap, looping infinitely, a place where time and space obeyed rules unknown to him. Exhaustion began to set in, muscles trembling from tension and cold, his mind fraying as the relentless maze continued to swallow him whole. By nightfall, the howls returned, louder and closer than before. They circled the cabin, weaving around him in impossible directions. The glowing eyes from the windows appeared again, more numerous, blinking in silent synchronization. He stumbled back toward the cabin, knowing instinctively that leaving was futile, that the forest had claimed the ground around him as its own. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of movement reinforced the same truth. The hollow would not let him go. He sank to the ground near the creek, chest heaving, and realized the full horror of it. The path he had trusted, the way home, the forest's natural boundaries, they were illusions. Hollow Creek had become a labyrinth, a living, breathing entity that refused to release him. And in that moment he understood. The longer he stayed, the more it would close in, folding time and space into itself, until he became part of the hollow, as inescapable as the shadows that watched, waited, and silently hunted. By the time darkness settled once more over Hollow Creek, he no longer distinguished between the cabin's walls and the forest beyond. The trees pressed in close, shadows crawling over each other, folding space into impossible angles. He had stopped trying to escape. Every path, every turn, every memory of direction had dissolved. The hollow was no longer a place. It was a presence, patient and deliberate, aware of him, shaping the very air he breathed. He lifted his camera one last time, hands trembling, fingers slick with sweat. If nothing else, he thought, at least there would be proof. Proof that something had existed here, that the forest had claimed him in ways no one could understand. He positioned it at the cabin doorway, aiming outward, adjusting the lens until the dark space beyond was filled with shadow, anticipation, and the quiet, insistent rustling that had haunted him for days. The flash caught them. For a heartbeat, the doorway was a tableau of twisted silhouettes pressed against the cabin walls. Limbs bent at impossible angles, torsos elongated and contorted, faces just barely human, staring without recognition or comprehension. They weren't all visible at once. The edges of the frame dissolved into darkness, but their presence was undeniable. In the photographs, he could see how close they had been, closer than any human could have approached without his noticing. The images were raw and impossible, a silent record of the intrusion, the observation, the relentless patience of Hollow Creek. He lowered the camera, and the silence that followed was more oppressive than the howls, more terrifying than the glowing eyes he had glimpsed through the windows. It was the quiet of being fully seen, of realizing that every step, every breath, every heartbeat had been catalogued by the forest, by whatever haunted the hollow. He pressed himself against the wall, waiting, listening. Every branch outside, every rustle of leaves, every shift in shadow became a pulse of presence. They were there, circling, watching, patient beyond reason. The night stretched on with no sign of reprieve. He did not move, could not move, for fear of provoking whatever force lingered at the edges of perception. Sleep was impossible. Closing his eyes invited glimpses of the silhouettes pressing into corners, their forms solid in the mind even if the darkness obscured them in reality. He realized, in a chilling clarity, that he had already become part of the hollow, not yet consumed, but accounted for, measured, observed. His existence had been folded into the rhythm of the forest, a participant in a game he could not hope to understand. By the first light of morning, the cabin was empty. The forest lay silent, the creek babbling as though nothing had transpired. He was gone, leaving only the camera behind, perched on the doorway where it had captured the final evidence. When the film was developed, or viewed on the screen, the photographs revealed the last record of him. The silhouettes pressed against the cabin walls had not moved, they had waited, and in the frames their proximity was unnerving. One image seemed to show them closer than physics should allow, limbs reaching impossibly, faces bending unnaturally toward where he had once stood. The hollow remained. The claw marks on the door were still etched deep in the wood. The footprints around the cabin faint but visible, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of something ancient and patient. Hollow Creek had claimed him, folded him into its rhythm, and left nothing behind but proof and anticipation. Whoever, or whatever, inhabited the shadows, waited still, measured the spaces between trees, observed the boundaries of perception, ready for the next visitor. The photographs were the only evidence of his presence, yet even they could not convey the full horror. The shapes beyond the doorway were not bound by distance, time, or logic. They existed in the threshold between seen and unseen, human and impossible, present and patient. He had vanished, and the forest had recorded his absence, leaving a memory pressed against the walls, a warning whispered in the rustle of leaves, and the lingering knowledge that Hollow Creek never forgot. And so the cabin stood, quiet and patient, the creek flowing beside it, the forest beyond waiting. Waiting for the next person to notice the shadows in the trees, to hear the soft, deliberate rustling behind the undergrowth, to feel the patient gaze of something that had always been there and always would be. The road ended long before he reached the ridge, leaving only a narrow trail of packed earth and old timber. He had walked it hundreds of times during his years as a ranger, but age had a way of turning familiar paths into uncertain ones. That evening, the mist sat low on the ground, thick enough to swallow the tops of his boots with every step. Even the usual forest sounds, the wind threading through needles, the distant call of an owl, were muted, as if the world had been wrapped in wool. He saw the hut only when he was nearly on top of it. The small trapper's cabin stood exactly where he remembered it, a shape cut out of the fog. Nothing about it looked disturbed. The shutters hung neatly. The door sat slightly ajar, the way he recalled it years ago when the trapper still lived there. It felt like walking into a memory no one had updated. He paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. Rows of iron traps ringed the clearing like a boundary line. Every single one was set, the thick jaws rusted but still ready to snap. And every trap faced the woods, never outward, always inward, like the person who placed them believed the danger wasn't in what escaped, but in what approached. He knelt beside one, brushing away a film of wet leaves. The metal was cold enough to numb his fingers. That was when he heard it. A faint, steady tapping somewhere deeper in the trees. Slow, deliberate. Too rhythmically human to be an animal. Too distant to identify. He straightened, listening harder. The tapping stopped. The fog thickened. And beneath the silence, something in the wood shifted. Just enough to remind him he hadn't come alone. He stepped away from the hut the next morning, hoping daylight would put the unease to rest. Fog still clung to the ridge, thinned only enough for shapes to flicker at the edges of his sight. He'd spent a lifetime reading forests the way other men read books, but this stretch of trees remained stubbornly blank, refusing to give him the comfort of familiarity. Even the scent of pine felt muted, as though the air itself held its breath. He walked toward the tree line, careful not to disturb the old traps. A wet hush settled over the moss at his feet, swallowing the sound of his steps. The branches above him sagged under the weight of moisture, but none of them moved. Not from wind, not from wildlife. Nothing shifted unless he shifted first. He scanned the fog. Something was there. He felt it before he saw anything. A low twinge at the base of his spine, the same instinct that once warned him of cougars stalking from above or black bears circling unseen. That subtle tightening crept across his back, urging him to slow, to listen, to let the woods reveal themselves on their terms. Then the trees stirred. Not from wind, because there was no wind. The air was as still as water in a sealed jar. But the branches near the far spruce began to sway in a strange, purposeful rhythm, as though someone tall was brushing through them, testing their flexibility, feeling their give. He couldn't see a figure, not clearly, but the motion suggested height, a shape too upright, too deliberate to be an animal. He narrowed his eyes, trying to make out the form behind the movement. The fog thinned just enough to show a long, dark silhouette leaning between two trunks, its edges soft, blurred by mist. It didn't walk, it didn't crouch, it only adjusted, like a person deciding how much of themselves to reveal. His lungs stalled in his chest, the shape withdrew before he fully registered it, slipping backward between the trees without sound. No twigs snapped. No brush parted. It simply blended into the fog as if the forest swallowed it whole. He took an involuntary step back toward the hut. The air changed with that single step. Colder, thinner, sharp enough to sting his throat. Instinct kicked in first. Retreat, regain shelter, put a barrier between him and whatever stood between the spruces. Another branch moved, this time closer. He didn't wait to see the source. He turned and made for the hut, boots dragging through damp soil. Yet the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse, like something tall paced him from within the fog, keeping perfect stride, never quite close enough to see, but close enough to sense. That same weight at the back of his neck pressed harder, inch by inch, as if a gaze followed the movement of his shoulders. He didn't dare look over his shoulder. Not yet. He knew the rules of the forest well enough. Acknowledge a presence too early, and you surrender the advantage. Instead, he kept his pace measured and his breaths controlled, trying to mask the quickening beat of his pulse. By the time he reached the clearing, the fog had thickened again, dense enough to dull the hut's outline. Only when he stepped onto the warped wooden platform did he allow himself one backward glance. The tree line looked empty, quiet. But that was wrong, deeply wrong. Forest emptiness never felt like that. It should have carried signs of life. The low rustle of critters, the flutter of wings, the shifting of distant branches. Instead, the woods stood still as carved stone, watching without blinking. He gripped the edge of the hut's doorframe. His hand shook despite the cold, despite the fact that he had dealt with far worse conditions during his ranger years. Experience meant nothing here. Something in this ridge operated outside the rules he knew. He stepped inside, hoping the walls would settle his nerves. The moment he crossed the threshold, a faint sound drifted behind him, a soft crumble of dirt like someone brushing their heel against the ground. He froze. Slowly, he turned. At the edge of the clearing, imprinted in the damp soil, were footprints. Fresh ones. Deep ones. A full circle's worth surrounding the hut as though something had walked perimeter after perimeter, studying the structure while he slept. The spacing between the prints chilled him the most. Far too long for a human stride. Made by something that walked with a purpose, with patience, and with height he didn't want to imagine. The mist swallowed the tree line once more, but he could feel eyes there, steady, waiting, measuring him the way a predator measures distance. The woods were no longer empty, they were waiting for him to come back out. He shut the door behind him, letting the dim interior swallow the last trace of fog. The hut smelled the way old cabins do, dust, damp wood, the faint mineral tang of cold iron. But beneath it all was something sharper, something sour, as if the air had not moved in years. The place looked untouched. Exactly as he remembered from the reports filed after the trapper vanished. A small cot, a rusted stove, a workbench cluttered with wire, bone fragments, and the remains of old snares. Nothing surprising, nothing new except the journal. It sat on the table dead center as if placed there for him. Not dropped, not forgotten. Placed. He hesitated before reaching for it. The leather cover was cracked with age, but the edges looked darker, almost swollen from moisture, or something else. When he lifted it, dust drifted from beneath as though it hadn't been moved in years. And yet the book felt strangely warm in his hands, holding a residual heat that didn't belong in that cold structure. He opened to the first filled page. The handwriting he recognized. Tight, frantic letters dug so hard into the paper they nearly tore through. The trapper had always been a strange man, quiet, solitary, prone to bouts of paranoia. But nothing in his old field interviews hinted at this level of obsession. The first entry described figures standing between the trees, tall shapes that leaned in unison whenever the trapper stepped outside. The next pages grew more erratic, lines slanting upward as though written during panic. Sketches of elongated silhouettes filled the margins, each scribble looking less human the further he flipped. But the part that made him pause was a repeated phrase scrawled along the bottom of 3 consecutive pages. The hunger that whispers. He stared at those words longer than he meant to. Something about them didn't read like metaphor. They felt literal, recorded with the same urgency as someone noting a fire spreading across a floorboard. He turned another page, another, blank again, but the edges were darkened, stained with something the color of old sap. He touched the corner. It crumbled under his fingertip like burnt paper. The blank pages weren't clean, they were empty in a way that felt purposeful, as though something had stripped them of meaning. He flipped again. A loud creak answered from above. He looked up. The roof beams sagged under decades of rot, the kind that groaned quietly under the weight of snowstorms or heavy branches. But this sound wasn't caused by settling. It had a pattern, a weight, a slow, dragging cadence that moved from one end of the roof to the other. He held still. The pacing continued, deliberate, measured, neither animalistic nor fully human. Each step pressed dust from between the boards, faint puffs drifting down in thin, shimmering lines. He followed the movement with his eyes, tracking the invisible path above him. The steps stopped directly over his head. Silence fanned out around the hut. Even the creek beyond seemed to hush. He waited. Seconds stretched into long, brittle strands of time. His breath hovered in his throat. Then the weight shifted. Not away. Down. The roof dipped a fraction of an inch. Wood fibers bending under pressure as something leaned onto the rafters. The boards strained, not enough to break, but enough to announce the presence of something far heavier than he wanted to imagine. He clutched the journal without realizing it. The pages fluttered under his thumb, and when he glanced back down, a line of text appeared on the blank page. He froze. It hadn't been there a moment earlier. The ink looked fresh, wet at the edges, glistening faintly in the dim light. He read it once, then again. It learns who enters. A chill threaded down his spine. He stepped backward instinctively, but the hut felt smaller now, the walls nearer, the ceiling lower. Above him, something shifted again, slowly, almost thoughtfully, as though responding to his movement. The beam creaked under a new distribution of weight. Another step. Closer to the center. Closer to him. He closed the journal, but the words stayed burned in his thoughts. A quiet warning he'd come too late to heed. Whatever the trapper wrote about hadn't left the ridge. It had been waiting for someone new to notice it. He waited until daylight before stepping back outside, hoping the morning would strip the ridge of its strangeness. The fog had thinned overnight, rising into torn silver ribbons drifting between the treetops. The air held an early chill, sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. He welcomed it. Anything was better than the stale, heavy atmosphere inside the hut. He walked past the first row of traps, careful not to disturb them. A faint frost clung to the metal jaws, glinting weakly in the muted light. The forest felt slightly more alive than the day before, though not by much. A distant bird call, a soft rustle of leaves, the faint rush of the creek far below. Small things, but enough to mark the world as normal again. Or so he wanted to believe. His boot nudged something in the grass. He looked down. A rabbit lay on its side, but something was wrong with the angle of its limbs. They were bent outward, stretched unnaturally, arranged in a crude, almost ceremonial shape. Its forelegs pointed upward like arms raised in supplication. Its hind legs jutted at a sharp angle, forming a crooked base like a distorted torso. The head was positioned forward, staring toward the hut. He crouched, studying it. No predator had done this. No scavenger left such clean, deliberate lines. A cold pressure settled at the base of his spine. He stepped deeper into the woods. 20 yards in, he found another scene. A raccoon this time, splayed out across a circle of stones. Its body was twisted into a human-like silhouette, arms spread, ribs exposed like fingers reaching for something unseen. The fur was sleek, unruffled, no bite marks, no struggle. The arrangement felt ritualistic, intentional. A message crafted with patience. He continued walking, though every instinct urged him back toward the hut. The trees closed around him, branches knitting into a canopy that darkened the forest floor. The further he moved, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, not even the gentle low hum of the creek. Silence like that didn't happen naturally. He exhaled slowly and pushed forward. 10 minutes deeper, he found a clearing he didn't remember existing. It was small, just wide enough for a single beam of pale light to break through the branches above. At its center lay the largest arrangement yet. 3 deer, each positioned as though frozen mid-step, but twisted in ways no living creature could ever have moved. their limbs bent back on themselves, elongated through force or breaking, forming long, upright silhouettes. One stood taller than he did, its head craning backward unnaturally. Their eyes were open. All of them stared toward the direction he had come, toward the hut. His skin tightened, the air felt colder. He backed away without meaning to, then he caught movement in the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, nothing but fog and trees. He took a breath to steady himself. The shape moved again. This time it wasn't subtle. A dark silhouette shifted between two pines, tall enough to loom above the underbrush. He couldn't make out features, just a long, lean form standing impossibly still. He froze. The figure didn't advance, didn't retreat. It simply waited, posture identical to the ones drawn in the trapper's frantic sketches. He stepped to the right, testing. The shadow followed. Exactly, perfectly. It mirrored him, not with delay, not with hesitation, but with precision, as though it already knew the motion before he made it. He moved left slowly, barely shifting his weight. The shape glided left too, matching his pace in a silent, deliberate rhythm. Something cold rolled through his chest. He tested again. Forward. The silhouette moved forward. Backward. It drifted backward. But even as it mirrored him, the distance between them felt wrong, like the forest around the figure stretched to hide the space it truly occupied. He couldn't tell if it was 10 feet away or 50. He only knew it was watching. He stepped back toward the hut, refusing to turn his back. The figure stilled, then its head tilted, just a fraction. Just enough to acknowledge the connection. He felt the gaze long after he lost sight of the shape, and every twisted carcass he passed on the way back seemed to stare with new purpose, guiding him, warning him, or marking him as the next piece in their pattern. The bridge felt different the moment he stepped onto it. Quieter, heavier, as if the whole span had been holding its breath since the moment he left the night before. The scratches were still there, long and deep, some splintering clean through the surface like claws dragged with purpose. He crouched to inspect them, running a finger along the torn edges, and the wood felt warm, almost pulsing, as though something inside it had only recently retreated. A faint smell of damp soil and old rotting bark drifted upward, out of place among the clean mountain air. He moved farther along the planks, each footstep sounding too loud in the stillness, each creak echoing like the bridge was whispering under its own weight. He kept catching tiny movements from the corner of his eye, shifts in the grain, dark lines bending, shadows tightening in places he wasn't looking directly at. When he knelt again to examine a cluster of gouges near the railing, the wood flexed beneath his palm, as if something pushed lightly up against it from below. The creek churned under him, dark water folding over itself, but he could hear something else beneath that, the faint tap of wood fibers straining, stretching. A single splinter rose at the center of one scratch, lifting upright like a needle, pointing directly at him. Then, along the entire length of the bridge, other splinters began to rise as well, one after another, forming a slow-moving ripple that advanced toward him like a living shiver. The planks trembled under his knees, a low groaning sound issuing from deep within the structure, not the noise of old timber, but something breathing through it. He backed away, but the boards behind him shifted, swelling upward as though something massive dragged its back beneath the wood, circling toward him in the dark. The scratches weren't old signs of struggle. They were fresh warnings, still unfinished, and whatever made them had never left. He tried to force himself to breathe normally as he moved toward the center of the bridge, but every step felt like walking over a thin sheet of ice with something rising beneath it. The rippling beneath the boards followed him, sometimes veering to one side, sometimes weaving directly under his feet, as if tracking the rhythm of his heartbeat. When he stopped, it stopped. When he stepped back, it shifted forward. The creek's current roared below, masking nothing. The wood groaned, stretched, whispered. He crouched again despite every instinct screaming not to, pressing one ear close to the planks. The bridge wasn't just settling under its own age, it was reacting to him. A soft, damp exhale pushed upward through the cracks, brushing warm across his cheek. He jerked away, but something thumped the underside of the wood, a slow, deliberate knock that traveled along the beam and vibrated up through his bones. Before he could stand, a thin line in the planks widened, splitting just enough for moonlight to skim across something beneath. Pale skin, slick with moisture, pressed so close that the grain left faint ridges along its surface. Then an eye slid into view, wide, unblinking, following his movements from inches below. He scrambled back, but the eye moved with him, gliding beneath the wood like it was part of the bridge itself. When he reached the midpoint of the span, the boards sagged as if something enormous shifted its weight under the entire structure. For a moment, he thought it would break open and drag him through. But instead, the breathing returned, slow, deliberate, and too close, while the eye vanished into darkness, leaving behind only the soft sound of fingertips brushing along the underside of the planks, tracing his every retreat. He never spoke of the woods again, not to the authorities, not to the other rangers, not even to the doctor who stitched the gash on his arm and asked how he managed to fall through a window at his age. He let them assume it was confusion, exhaustion, anything ordinary that didn't require him to revisit the thing that had crawled out of the hut's doorway as though it had always known him. He burned his clothes, kept the journal locked in a box beneath his bed, and spent the next few nights waking with the suffocating certainty that the mist from the ridge had followed him home. It wasn't until the fourth morning, gray, silent, the kind of morning where the air feels thick and waiting, that he realized the journal was heavier. He had never opened it since fleeing, yet now the leather bulged, swollen with pages that hadn't existed before. He told himself he wouldn't look. He told himself he would throw it into the nearest river and walk away. But when he finally loosened the strap and opened it, the smell of the hut rolled out. Damp wood, cold metal, and something sweet rotting at the edges. The new entries were written in the same frantic hand as the trapper's notes, but the words described things the trapper could never have seen. The ranger's escape through the broken window, the blood on his sleeve, the way he stumbled through the dark while something followed at a steady, patient distance. Page after page detailed moments he hadn't realized he'd been watched. His collapse at the tree line, his trembling hands lighting a match at camp, the way he whispered to himself just to hear a human sound. Then the dates shifted. The writing moved beyond memory into the recent hours. His walk back into town. His decision not to tell anyone. The sound of the wind rattling his windows last night. His breath froze when he turned to the final page. The entry was dated tonight. The ink was still wet, the strokes sharp and confident. It described him sitting exactly where he was now, the journal open, dread settling into his spine. And then the last line, short, unfinished, waited as though the writer had paused only long enough for him to reach it. It is standing behind you. The gate collapsed under its own weight, twisted iron groaning as I slipped through the gap at dusk. The world behind me softened into shadow, and the last scraps of light vanished as I stepped onto the gravel-strewn floor. My boots crunched softly, echoing off walls that smelled of rust and damp decay. I told myself I was here for the blog, for photos and stories that would revive interest in my stagnant channel. But as soon as I passed the threshold, the weight of the abandoned mine pressed down in a way no camera or lens could capture. Water dripped from overhead beams, the sound steady, measured, unnervingly deliberate. At first, I counted the intervals, 1, 2, 3, but soon the rhythm began to feel wrong, almost like footsteps following me, echoing just out of sight. I paused, flashlight trembling in my hand. But the drops continued, indifferent to my awareness. They fell in a pattern that seemed aware of me, or perhaps the mine itself was awake in some imperceptible way. The air grew colder with each step. I could see my breath condense in the beam of my light, small clouds that lingered longer than they should. Old mine carts rested frozen along the rails, like witnesses turned to metal, wheels still, rusted gears jammed in mid-rotation. I passed them slowly, every scrape of metal underfoot amplified. A faint, almost imperceptible voice broke through the dripping, soft, nasal, calling a name I had never heard. Just a whisper at first, barely louder than the water. I stopped, holding my flashlight steady, listening. It repeated, or maybe I imagined it, and the echo seemed to come from all directions at once, folding into the cold like smoke. I pressed forward, telling myself I had to reach the deeper tunnels. Each step seemed to multiply the silence, the air thickening with something unseen. The walls themselves smelled metallic, a coppery tang that clung to my gloves and skin. Somewhere deeper, the drip began to fall faster, in irregular patterns that sounded less like water and more like deliberate taps. My pulse jumped with every echo, and the shadows at the edge of my light flickered, bending against the rough stone. The deeper I went, the more the mine seemed to contract, the passages narrowing, forcing me to duck beneath beams and squeeze past fallen rock. The voice lingered, just out of reach, repeating that unknown name with a cadence I couldn't shake. I tried recording it, but the microphone caught only static, as if the sound didn't belong to this world. My camera flashed in the dim light, illuminating empty beams and rail carts. Yet, even in the still photographs, shadows lingered where nothing should have been. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, the entrance had disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dusk and the weight of the mine itself. The dripping continued, steady, deliberate. The voice whispered again. I wasn't sure if it had been calling to me, or calling for me. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. The mine had begun to fold around me, and every step forward felt like a descent into a memory I didn't belong to. The deeper I moved into the mine, the colder the air became, carrying the sharp tang of iron and something older, fouler beneath it. I rounded a bend and froze. There, on the cracked stone floor, a ring of century-old pickaxes and helmets lay arranged with deliberate symmetry, as if someone, or something, had set them down just moments before. Dust covered the edges, but it had been disturbed, scattered in fine lines that led back toward the shadows. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, the beam bending and jerking as if the mine itself were breathing around me. I crouched to examine the formation, and a shiver ran through me. Each tool gleamed faintly under my light, edges catching reflections that shouldn't have been there, as though the metal remembered every swing, every strike it had ever known. The helmets sat like empty skulls, staring at me with hollow eyes. My boots scuffed lightly against the dust, and I could have sworn the pattern shifted ever so slightly when I blinked. A faint whisper of movement grazed the stone behind me. Something metallic scraped across the floor, slow, deliberate, unhurried. My pulse spiked, But when I turned, nothing waited, just shadow, curling into itself. The flashlight flickered again. A sputtering heartbeat in the darkness, and I realized the mine wasn't passive. The air hummed faintly, as if the tools themselves drew in breath and exhaled it against the silence. Each step toward the circle seemed to stretch time. The echo of my own movement lingered longer than natural. I circled the ring, trying to record it, to capture the eerie symmetry, but the camera seemed to lag, or the images blurred, as if resisting the light. Dust motes twirled in the beam like tiny ghosts, yet every shadow remained fixed, rigid, as if watching. I swallowed hard. The scraping came again. Closer this time. Not hurried, not frantic, methodical. The sound traveled along the walls, ricocheting off beams and rails, but never reached a corner where I could pinpoint it. I spun in a slow circle, heart hammering, ears straining against the dripping and the distant, impossibly rhythmic scraping. It ceased abruptly as my flashlight flared, the shadows contracting into the corners like liquid. I felt the weight of unseen eyes along my spine. The mine had claimed the rhythm. It decided when to breathe, when to shift, when to make me pause and listen. And though the tools were still in a perfect circle, I could feel them vibrating faintly beneath my touch, as if alive, or alive to something I could not name. A single hair of doubt became a full thread in my mind. Maybe I wasn't the intruder here. Maybe I had wandered into a memory the mine refused to release, and it was waiting, patient, deliberate, for me to stumble too far forward. I straightened, moving back toward the tunnel. The circle remained unbroken, yet the metallic scrape trailed me, faint and insistent, fading only when I thought I could turn around. Behind me, the shadows seemed to lean forward, watching, waiting, and the mine whispered a secret I could almost catch, but not fully, not yet. The tunnel walls seemed to shift under the beam of my flashlight, stone curling into shadows that didn't belong. Etched across the rock were strange markings, skeletal outlines carved with claw-like precision, ribs stretching and bending in ways that felt almost deliberate. I stepped closer, heart tightening, and traced one with the tip of my finger. The stone was cold and rough, yet the shape seemed to respond, angling slightly toward me, as if it had been waiting for recognition. I pulled back, suddenly aware of the echo of my own breath filling the tunnel, mingling with the quiet drip of water somewhere far ahead. I raised the camera to capture the carvings, a futile attempt to tether the place to reality. Each flash revealed something new, smears of dust that resembled elongated hands, shadows where there had been none moments before. I froze. My own reflection, or something like it, fluttered in the lens for just a heartbeat before disappearing. A low whisper threaded through the dark, soft but urgent, repeating a name I didn't know. The syllables wrapped around the stone like smoke, curling into the corners, leaving the hairs on my neck standing. I spun the flashlight, searching for movement, but the tunnel remained still, impossibly still, save for the ever-shifting skeletal outlines. I stepped forward cautiously, following the carvings, each one taller than the last, their ribs jutting unnaturally, pointing toward some unseen center deeper in the mine. My boots scuffed against dust, raising tiny clouds that settled almost immediately, as if the walls absorbed them. The whisper repeated, merging with my heartbeat, a rhythm I could neither match nor escape. Every step became heavier, not from exhaustion, but from the sensation that the mine itself remembered me, or was beginning to remember me. The shadows of the skeletal shapes seemed to lean closer, tilting toward the flashlight's glow, reaching with empty bones for something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The temperature dropped suddenly. My breath puffed in thick clouds, lingering too long in the still air. I could hear the faint scrape of metal somewhere behind me, distant but deliberate. Yet every time I turned, nothing waited. Only the walls, remembering, shifting, bending, insistent in their silent vigilance. I raised the camera again, hoping the flash might hold the shapes in place, but the photograph betrayed me. Each frame revealed new smears, lines that hadn't existed a moment before. And in the final image, a shadowy form lingered just beyond the light, bent at an angle that felt wrong. Impossible. I realized then that I was not walking into a dead mine. I was walking into a memory alive, a place that shifted to recognize and respond to my presence. The skeletal outlines were patient, waiting, stretching, adjusting to the rhythm of my exploration. And somewhere in the dark, the whisper came again, naming me with a syllable that made my skin crawl, leaving me wondering if the mine had always known I would come, or if it had simply learned me as I went. Every step forward carried the unshakable certainty that I had already moved here before, and yet I could never leave unmarked. I tried to map the tunnels, to convince myself there was a pattern, some rational route through the abandoned mine. But every turn I took betrayed me. Corridors I had walked moments ago looped back onto themselves, the same broken support beam rising ahead no matter which direction I chose. My footprints overlapped in chaotic circles, snow or dust no longer a reliable record of where I had been. The air thickened, cold and metallic, and every step seemed to echo back at me a half-second too late. As if the mine was mocking my sense of time, the darkness pressed closer with each turn, and the beam of my flashlight barely reached the walls, distorted by moisture and shadow. I traced the path I believed I had taken, yet the tunnel itself seemed to bend, corridors stretching and compressing without warning. My stomach knotted as I realized I had begun to lose track of my own movement. Forward, backward, left, right. It all became meaningless. The walls were closing in, or maybe I had simply become smaller, swallowed by the memory of this place. Something moved nearby. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of light and shadow. Then I felt it. A warm, moist breath fogging my lens, too close to ignore. I spun, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Only the endless stone and the faint drip of water from the ceiling. The breathing receded, slow, deliberate, fading into the hollow tunnels before I could pinpoint its source. My pulse echoed in my ears, matching the rhythm of the place, or perhaps of whatever waited unseen. Panic pressed into my chest. Every attempt to retrace my steps only brought me back to the same broken support beam, the same pile of fallen rock. Footprints I didn't recognize appeared behind me, crossing my own in impossible patterns. My flashlight flickered as if warning me, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the shapes moving just beyond the edges of its light. I raised the camera instinctively, snapping photo after photo, but the images offered no comfort. Each frame revealed distortions, overlapping shadows, faint silhouettes that shouldn't exist in the static walls. I pressed onward, though I didn't know why. The tunnels themselves had become a predator, guiding me, reshaping themselves around my footsteps. The unseen breath whispered again, close enough to rattle my lens, then vanished, leaving only the echo of my own fear. I realized with a sinking certainty that I was no longer exploring a mine. I was moving through something alive, something that remembered me, that could rearrange itself while I watched helplessly. The path forward had become a trap disguised as exploration, and somewhere just beyond my light the unseen waited, patient, letting me chase the illusion of direction while the tunnels closed tighter around me. The further I moved, the more the mine resisted being seen. At the edges of my flashlight's beam, thin figures flickered. Humanoid shapes, impossibly bent, moving too fast to follow, and yet too deliberate to dismiss. Every time I swung the light toward them, the glow dulled, swallowed by shadows that clung to the walls and ceiling like black water. I snapped photo after photo, hoping the camera would capture what my eyes couldn't, a feeble attempt to prove that the shapes were real and not just the product of exhaustion and fear. Each flash illuminated fragments of the tunnel, the dusty floor, rusted carts frozen mid-fall, skeletal markings etched into stone. But always, always, a shadow lingered just beyond the circle of light. At first, I thought I imagined them, but the photographs told a different story. In each frame, a figure crept closer, thin limbs elongating in ways no human body could, tilting its head, lingering at the periphery, almost aware of the camera itself. I spun, aiming the flashlight in every direction, but the forms never fully revealed themselves. The air around me seemed to pulse with them, vibrating faintly, a rhythm I could feel in my chest and in the soles of my boots. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor seemed to lean toward me, containing me, pressing me into the lightless corners where the shapes could move freely. My breath fogged in the cold air, and for the first time I realized the mine wasn't just hiding them, they were watching, calculating, waiting. Then I froze. A silhouette stood behind me, tall and thin, bent at an angle that made my stomach lurch. It didn't move with the erratic speed I'd seen before. It simply waited. My pulse roared in my ears, and my hand shook as I raised the camera again, desperate to capture proof. But the lens caught nothing beyond the dense black of shadow and the trembling walls. When I lowered the flashlight, the figure was gone, yet the sense of being observed remained, heavy and suffocating. Every step I took forward seemed to draw the shadows nearer. The mine had stopped being a passive trap. It had become an active presence, shaping what I saw, hiding what I needed, revealing only fragments of what lurked just beyond the light. And somewhere in the darkness, I could feel them moving, circling, patient, waiting for me to panic, waiting for me to make a mistake. I knew then that I was no longer simply exploring an abandoned mine. I was inside something alive, something that used shadows as skin and silence as breath. And it had already begun to stalk me. The light didn't just fade, it vanished entirely, swallowed as if the mine itself had inhaled it. One moment, my flashlight cast trembling circles across the walls, and the next, I was enveloped in a dense, black nothing that pressed against my skin and filled my lungs with cold. The familiar drip of water became distant, muted, replaced by a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground trembled beneath me, not from collapse, but from something moving, unseen, powerful, and patient. Whispers filled the dark, names I had never heard, repeated over and over until they became a chant, rising and falling in a cadence that made my stomach knot. At first, I tried to follow one thread of sound, to locate the source, but the voices multiplied, overlapping, merging into a chorus that pressed against my sanity. Each breath I drew felt thick, heavy with cold and fear, and I could feel the black mass of the mine tightening around me, pushing, nudging, herding me deeper into its labyrinth. I raised the camera, hoping even a single photograph might anchor reality, but the flash captured only a dense blackness that seemed to consume everything in its frame. Shapes shifted just beyond perception, humanoid yet wrong, their angles impossible, bending against physics. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the darkness made movement uncertain. The tunnel itself had become treacherous, slipping beneath my boots, rearranging my path as I stumbled forward. The whispers grew louder, urgent, insistent, as though whatever lurked in the shadows had learned to call, to demand, to feed. My hands shook violently as I fumbled the flashlight, and for a moment, I thought the blackness had reached into me, not just around me. The rhythm of the mine, the low vibration beneath my feet, matched the pulse racing in my chest, a syncopation of terror that left me disoriented and dizzy. And then I saw it, or felt it, closing in. Not fully formed, not completely visible, just a presence that bent the air, warped the darkness, and pressed upon me with a weight I could not lift. I stumbled backward, raised the camera one last time, and the flash caught nothing but the consuming black, a dense, hungry void that seemed to breathe in time with me. My heart thundered as I realized I had no direction, no way out, and that the mine had stopped being merely a place to explore. It had become a predator. And it was feeding. Days later, rescuers found the mine entrance quiet, almost serene. But my gear told a different story. Everything was neatly piled, boots aligned, helmet resting atop a stack of frozen rags, the camera perched carefully on the topmost rock as if placed with intention. There was no sign of me, no footprints leading away, just the meticulous arrangement of my belongings, the air still humming with the memory of movement. The tunnel beyond remained dark and silent, but the walls had changed, new skeletal outlines etched in fresh scratches, unfamiliar shapes pressed into stone where nothing had been before. The camera held the last evidence. The final roll of photographs revealed the figures creeping closer, frame by frame, inching toward the lens, until the last image was nothing but dense black. The shapes bent and twisted, impossible limbs folding in directions no human body could. I could feel them closing in even without seeing them, a pressure that seemed to press against the backs of anyone who looked too long. The static in the files hummed like the mine itself, resonating through bone and breath. The rescuers noted the fresh markings, puzzled, murmuring theories about pranksters or wind-carved scratches, but none lingered long enough to feel the pulse beneath the stone. And then, just as they began to leave, a faint whisper came from the tunnel, carried on the cold wind that escaped the entrance. It spoke a name none of them recognized, but one that had haunted me throughout. The one that had threaded through every shadow, every echo, every bend in the tunnels. It lingered, impossible to pin down, dissolving into the dark, leaving only a memory of fear. The mine was quiet again, but the precision of my abandoned gear, the photographs and the new marks on the wall made it clear. Whatever had followed me here, whatever had learned me, had not finished. It waited, patient and deliberate, somewhere in the black, shaping the space around it. And perhaps, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to step past the rusted gate. I had left the mine behind, but the mine had not left me. Its memory was carved into every shadow, every whisper, and every echo of the names it still carried.